So moving on to the next presenter, for the latest findings from the Equine Injury Database, please welcome Dr. Parkin. He's the head of the Division of Equine Clinical Sciences and senior lecturer at the University of Glasgow.
Thanks very much for the invitation to come and speak again at this really important summit. I think it's probably sort of now becoming recognized as the best sort of worldwide knowledge exchange for the racing industry with respect to the welfare of the thoroughbred, and I really appreciate the invitation to talk again. Many of you will be aware that we've been working on the analyses of the equine injury database for a number of years now, 5 or 6 years, in collaboration with the Jockey Club, us at the University of Glasgow, and I have to acknowledge the funding that came from the Jockey Club for a PhD student who is now about to wrap up his work on prediction of injuries, fatal injuries in US racing, North American racing. I've talked about that a couple of times over the last 2 or 3 years, and this time I'm taking a little bit of a different tack. We noticed quite a dramatic drop in the rate of fatal injuries in 2015 compared to previous years when we did our annual audit of the data for the Jockey Club back in February and March. And we started thinking, well, what are the causes of this drop? What has actually contributed to the drop? Can we find anything that actually you guys have done that modified the way you conduct racing that actually has explained some of that drop? So that's the focus of the talk I'm going to be giving today. So I'm going to go through what the figures tell us, just remind you what the raw data and the raw figures are actually telling us, look at the year-on-year changes in risk of fatal injury. As I said, try and identify what might be responsible for those changes. And in doing that, what I'm going to be looking at is looking at the change in prevalence or the change in frequency of the known risk factors that we've identified over the last 5 or 6 years. And then attempt, with rather loose calculations, to approximate the contribution of each of those factors and then draw some conclusions. I'm an epidemiologist, sometimes called a statistician, which I kind of rebut a little bit. I'm not a statistician, I'm not that qualified. I'm an epidemiologist, talk about study design. And I wouldn't really be standing here and talking about this drop in the rate of fatal injury if I didn't believe that actually was something that's significant. This is a far greater drop in the rate of fatal injury in 2015 than you would expect by statistical blip, in my opinion. So I wouldn't want to be talking up here about just a purely statistical blip. I think this is a true effect. So if we look at the overall rate for the whole period of the equine injury database from 2009 to 2015, you see on your left, the overall rate of around 1.9 per thousand starts, dropping down for turf of about 1.6, dirt overall over the whole period about 2, and then synthetic down to about 1.2 per thousand starts. So there's clearly a very significant difference in the risk of fatal injury on the different surfaces in use in North America. And you see the little bars above and below the little dots. Those are the confidence intervals around those estimates. So they essentially say, how confident are we that that is a consistent and accurate estimate of the risk on those different surfaces? And you see, anyone who's come to any of these presentations before, you will notice that those bars are getting slowly tighter and tighter and tighter, and that's purely a manifestation of the fact that we have more data available to us. And you can see that those bars, specifically around the estimate that encompasses all surfaces and that encompasses dirt, are very, very tight indeed. So we're very, very confident that those are the true estimates of risk on the surfaces we're talking about. Now, if we look at that broken down by year. So we now have 7 full years of data which we play with, sort of 09 to 15. And that's the risk on all surfaces put together. And that has dropped, as you can see. There was an initial drop in the first year and then it stayed relatively stable. But then, as you can see, there's been a significant drop in the 1 year from 14 to 15. Overall, from about 1.9 in 2014 to 1.6 per thousand starts in 2015. On turf, you can see the bars are that much wider because we have far fewer starts on turf than obviously we do on dirt and others. But again, and you see that the data is a little bit more sporadic, it's a little bit all over the place, but they all essentially tend to sit within the same confidence interval, so we're not really that concerned, certainly up to 2015, that essentially it's staying at a relatively stable level. But again, on comparing 2015 to 2014, there was a significant drop from 1.8 to 1.3 fatal injuries per 1,000 starts on turf. You compare that to dirt, and again, you see a similar pattern to the overall rate. That's because dirt contributes the vast majority of starts in North American racing. And you see a relatively stable sort of figure up to 2014, but then this dramatic drop. 2014 was about 2.4, 2015 was about 1.79. And it's actually the first year that the figure has actually dropped below the 2.0 per 1,000 starts level. Prior to that, it had ranged from about 2 to 2.1 per 1,000 starts. So it's a much bigger drop than any previous raises we've seen in the data, and I believe it truly significant. And then finally on synthetic, well, we know that synthetic consistently performs better in the terms of risk of fatal injury. And for that reason, it's probably more difficult to see a significant drop in the risk of fatal injury on synthetic. After that initial first-year drop, then the rate has stayed relatively similar at about 1.2 per 1,000 starts. So for the reasons you can see up here, the biggest drop in terms of number of horses that have been prevented from being fatally injured has come related to dirt. So I'm going to focus the rest of the talk on dirt. Before I do that, I just want to show you this plot here, which is the percentage improvement in risk of fatal injury on previous years. So every year, this plot essentially compares the current year we're in with the previous year. So 2010 compared to 2009, 2011 compared to 2010, etc. And being in the blue shaded area is a good thing, okay? So that's the percentage improvement. And you can see, and I put this up just to show you the impact of the size of the number of starts has on the data we have and how confident we can be that actually changes are important. You see the turf line is the blue line, and that goes a bit up and down all over the place. So there's no real consistency there. We're not seeing any real pattern, and that is reflected by the large confidence intervals we saw on the previous graph. Contrast that to the red line, where for the years 2011 to 2013, we saw minor increases, relatively small increases in the risk of injury on dirt compared to the previous year. But certainly since 2013 to 2014, and 2014 especially to 2015, we've seen a very significant improvement in the risk of fatal injury on dirt. As much so that in 2015 compared to 2014, we see a 12% drop in the risk of fatal injury on dirt in those 2 years, which I believe is a very significant finding. So what's responsible for that improvement? So we build models that look for risk factors, and then we build predictive models to try and understand whether we can actually predict which of those horses that entering starts are actually at greatest risk of suffering an injury. And that's our bread and butter. But we took this different approach for this particular analysis and talk to look at the known risk factors we've identified. There are going to be other unknown risk factors we've yet to identify, or we may never identify, and that might be because we don't have the tools to enable us to do it. We don't have the data available to us to enable us to do it. So there are obvious areas such as medication or veterinary treatment histories of the individual horses that we just don't have access to, which are probably going to be pretty important risk factors. And then there's also going to be a degree of natural variation that we just simply will never be able to account for. But the idea is that we shift as many of those unknown risk factors into the known risk factor to group, so we can better predict which horses are more likely to sustain a fatal injury. These are just a variety of the known risk factors that we've identified, and you can see that they're sort of clustered by size, sort of indicates their importance in terms of size of effect. And they're clustered sort of in terms of risk factors that affect the horse or associated with the horse, risk factors associated with the surface, risk factors associated with medical history and that sort of thing, and previous racing history. There are lots of different risk factors I've identified, and I picked out maybe 6 or 7 or 8 risk factors for the rest of the talk which come from this group. that we've seen consistently reported as being important in not only the studies we've done on North American racing, but also in other jurisdictions, and that have a relatively consistent and important effect in terms of the risk of fatal injury on the track. So as I said, we've identified close to 20 different risk factors over the 5 years, and that's I'd like to say it's unprecedented in terms of the number of risk factors we're identifying, and that's largely due to the massive amount of data that we are able to utilize. And it talks back to Mick Peterson's comment about the fact that data really is driving our ability now to have impact on equine welfare. The models we're building are now including more than 2.5 million race starts, and now we've recently started including more than 4 million work starts as well, so fast work records into those databases. The PhD student who does the work sets models running on a Friday evening and will go back on a Monday morning, and they might just about be finishing up. So it gives you an idea as to the complexity of the models we're building and the computing power that is required to actually run these models effectively. Believe you me, he doesn't set a model running unless he's pretty sure that he's got the algorithm correct. Otherwise, he has to sit there for 2 days waiting for it to finish. It's not something you can halt very easily. So there's a lot of preparatory work goes into these models before you set them running. So we're looking now, in this talk, to look whether the prevalence of any of these risk factors has changed during the time of the EID, and I'm going to plot those against the risk of fatal injury on dirt. So I'm going to focus on dirt over the same period. So to start off with, this is the plot of the risk of fatal injury on dirt, 2009 to 2015. And it clearly demonstrates this significant reduction in risk in the last 12 months, or 2014 compared to 2015, I should say. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to take a series of the risk factors we know are important and see how they have changed over the same time period. Some of them are more convincing than others. I'd have loved to be able to stand here and present a series of graphs that show a complete matching of the risk and the risk factor, or a complete mirroring of it if it's a risk factor that is beneficial. But that clearly was never going to be the case. That was the vision I had for this talk at the beginning, and clearly I was hunting around for graphs that would look very pretty and demonstrate that very convincingly, but that was never really going to be the case. Otherwise, those things would have been identified many, many moons ago as being something of particular interest. But certainly with this, so off-dirt is a definition we use for dirt races run on anything apart from fast dirt. Being off-dirt is a bad thing. Racing off-dirt is a bad thing. On off-dirt surface is a bad thing. So surface conditions certainly has an impact. And you see that from a low from 2010, when there were relatively few off-dirt races, we went to a peak, and then it started to come down again. And certainly there has been a reduction in 2014, 2015. But it's not particularly convincing in terms of actually mirroring the blue plot in terms of the risk of fatal injury. That blue plot is essentially going to stay there, and I'm just going to change the red line to represent the different risk factors we're interested in. So I can't remember whether you use your term intact or entire male horses over here, and I get confused between UK and US, whichever we use. But this is a plot of entire or intact male horses. Those horses are at significantly greater risk of fatal injury compared to other genders. And you see that although 2014 to 15 did have a slight rise, and actually the trend has been since 2011 for there to be a significant drop in the number of starts, or the percentage of starts made by intact horses. So that is likely to have contributed to some extent to the recent drop we've seen in fatal injury risk. Horses in their first start. So we truncated the red line here because there was some question marks over 2010 data as to horses being their first start. You can understand if we're starting a new database, actually to ensure that horses are truly making their first start, we have to sort of drop the first couple of years. Being in their first start is a reduced risk, so actually it's a good thing for horses. So their first start is a relatively safe start compared to all other starts they make. And in this particular case, so you'd expect, if there's a relationship, you'd expect the red line to be going up while the blue line comes down. And indeed, that's what we saw. We saw a relatively close mirroring or shadowing of the two lines, such that now we're in a position where there are many more horses making their first start in 2015 or than 2013. The percentage ranges from about 4.9 now up to about 5.3. And that sort of level of change is something we'll talk about later, and I'll try and quantify how much of a contribution that would have made to the reduction in the fatal injury rate we saw in 2015. This is something I know remains a relatively hot topic with you guys over here. I think I've talked about it almost every time I've come over to speak at the summit. Age at first start is one of my passions. I need to talk about it more and more and more whenever I possibly can. Starting a horse as a young horse, as a 2-year-old, is a good thing. It's unquestionable. There are many, many epidemiological papers out there that concur with this finding. There are some that don't, but there are none that suggest the opposite. I have yet to find a single epidemiological paper around the world that suggests actually racing a horse as a youngster is a bad thing. There are some that fail to find the association, but the vast majority find that actually racing as a youngster is a good thing. And there are lots of biological, bone-related reasons why that might be the case, which we've been into before. And this is essentially the average age at first start. And you can see, again, we truncated the data a little bit because of this first start issue, not being sure when their first start was. But that has dropped a little bit from around maybe just over 3 to just about 2.9 years is the age at which horses make their first start. The important thing about age at first start is that actually, if you start horses racing as 2-year-olds, it actually confers a reduction in risk for the whole of their career. So this reduction we see, quite significant reduction we see 2011, 12, and 13, and 14 is actually going to be beneficial for those horses throughout the rest of their career. So we're hopefully going to continue to see this benefit as we go through the years. And just to reiterate that point, this is the percentage of starts made by 2-year-olds. And it relatively closely mirrors the blue line in terms of risk of fatal injury. 2-year-old starts are a good thing. They're at reduced risk compared to all other aged horses. And as the blue line rose slightly between 2010 and 2013, the percentage of starts made by 2-year-olds dropped. But then the reverse happened. So as the rate of fatal injury on dirt started to drop, the percentage of horses racing as 2-year-olds started to rise. A couple of other risk factors that actually haven't been identified from other racing jurisdictions, but we feel are particularly important over here, is the amount of time with the same trainer. Longer is better. So the longer horses spend with the same trainer, then slowly their risk of fatal injury reduces. The first start with a new trainer is their riskiest start for that trainer. And you can see here again, so we've truncated a little bit because of the question mark over 2010 data in terms of whether they've genuinely been with the same trainer for the same amount of time. But again, this number is slowly creeping up, going from an average of 7 months up to now getting up to sort of closer to 8.5 months with the same trainer. And that's an average, national average across the whole picture. So that's going in the right direction, hopefully partially corresponding to the reduction in risk on dirt. And then again, so talking about racing intensity, days since the last race, this is our easy proxy measure of the average days between races. And again, that's a good thing. So the longer that is currently, then the better it is for the racehorse. And that's slowly been going up as well. Probably, if you look from 2011, is probably saved from about 39 up to about 40 days average between races. And that might seem a very small amount. So it's only a 1 day extra per month, one day extra between races. But actually those small marginal gains all contributing together are likely to have had a significant impact and contributed to this significant reduction in the risk of fatal injuries on dirt. And then the final one I want to talk about, which is peculiar to this side of the pond, I guess. In the UK, the longer the race is, then the greater the risk. In this country, it's the reverse. So there's six furlongs or less races are actually present a greater risk. And this shows the plot. The red line is the percentage of starts that were made at 6 furlongs or less, dropping from about 57% in 2009, down to about 54% in 2015. And that can only be a good thing. A 3% drop might, again, seem like a relatively small drop, but again, marginal gains. That small little marginal gain might well have contributed to the reduction in risk that we saw. Okay, so I admit, those are some interesting plots, but they don't really tell us that much. There's not a lot of very close mirroring of a lot of the plots there. So what we want to do now is actually try and quantify and understand whether any of those changes actually could have contributed to the reduction that we saw in 2014-15. And there's relatively simple calculations we can do for that, and they look at the change in prevalence of risk factors between the 2 years, or between the average of 2009 to 2014 compared to 15, and account for the size of effect of that risk factor. So in other words, the simplest thing you could think of is, okay, if we have a risk factor that doubles the risk, what would happen to the overall prevalence or the overall risk if we totally eliminated that risk factor? And that's clearly not going to be feasible with the vast majority of risk factors, but we've eliminated a proportion of some of these risk factors. So we can do the calculation to say, okay, what would happen if we totally eliminated the risk, that particular risk factor? How much would we expect our risk of fatal injury to reduce by? And then we times that essentially by the proportion of the change in the risk factor that we've actually identified. So we actually modify that in that way. So just to do these comparisons, and essentially if we take the see-through box as 100% of the change we've identified between 2014 and 2015, we've done some calculations here that estimate that surface condition for a start, so being off dirt, has probably contributed about 6.3% of the change that we saw, okay? So we can stack that up there. We've got male horses. That's probably contributed about 4.2% of the change that we saw between 2014 and 15. Age at first start, that's contributed a little bit more, about 8.4% of the change that we saw between 2014 and 2015 on dirt. Time with the same trainer, about 5% of the change in risk is likely contributed by this change that we've seen with the time with the same trainer. Days since the last race seems relatively important as well. That's contributed about 6% of the change in risk we've seen in 2014 to 15. And then finally, race distance. So this fact that we've seen a slowly dropping off in the number of 6 furlongs or less starts has contributed about 4% of the change in risk we've seen between 2014 and 15. So I should say it's not possible to do these calculations for all risk factors because some of them are in a continuous form that makes it very difficult to do the calculations. So we've chosen the ones that appear to have the greatest impact and for which it's easy to do these calculations. But altogether, those risk factors, those 6 risk factors, appear to have contributed about 35% of the change in risk between 2014 and 15 on dirt. That means there's still another 65% that we're yet to really explain. And that's not really surprising to us. We'd like to be able to explain more, but there are lots of other things that we think are important that we haven't simply included in these data, these analyses, simply because A, the data may not be available, or we just don't have a way of doing so. Veterinary history, complete training records, and those things. We're now starting to get a handle on training records, so hopefully that should make a difference to our predictive models. Changes in medication regulations are quite difficult to model over the period of 2009 to 2015. Quite difficult for us to model in the models that we have and include in those models. There are bound to be lots of local modifications to what goes on the racecourse that simply we don't know about. That simply are things that individuals on the track change to make racing safer at the track that we just don't have available to us in these national models. There are potentially other variables that are just unmeasured and unknown. Essentially, people just don't know that they're doing a good thing. There are lots of things there that are just inherent, and actually people are just becoming more aware of equine welfare in the racing industry and just doing better things. And as I said, there's bound to be a little bit of natural or random variation, but as an optimist, I would hope we can reduce that amount as much as possible and be able to explain as much of the drop as we possibly can. One thing I do want to reiterate is that the change is not, that we've seen between 2014 and 2015, is not simply due to a change in the tracks that report to the EID. A few tracks closed between 2014 and 2015, and a few tracks came in and started reporting to the EID in 2015. And we looked at the risk associated with those two groups of tracks, and there was very, very little difference between the two. So it's not simply, what we've identified is not simply an artifact of the fact that actually we've got a change in the population of the racetracks that report to the EID. Having said that, there were a few tracks that had very significant reductions in risk between 2014 and 15. And by significant risk, we had to sort of create some sort of definition of what we determined to be a significant risk. And that was essentially more than 5 fewer fatal injuries between 14 and 15. And putting it in percentage terms, comparing the average from 2009 to 2014 to 2015, a significant percentage reduction. So that actually percentage reduction lay somewhere between 13 and 53% change in the risk in 2015 compared to the average over the previous 5 years or 6 years. So just a little bit of a look at actually what those individual tracks did and what happened at those tracks. Most of the tracks had a significant drop, which had a significant drop in risk, had the following: a 2 to 9% reduction in starts on off dirt. And if you remember, the national average reduction was 0.8% reduction. A 2 to 10-fold greater increase in average months with the same trainer. So these tracks demonstrated a 0.14 to 0.77 increase in months, whereas the national average was about 0.07 between 2014 and 15. A 3 to 5-fold greater increase in the average days since last race. So something between 1.3 and 2.45 days longer, whereas the average between 2014 and 15 was about 0.45 days. And a 2 to 4.5% reduction in the percentage of starts on less than 6 furlongs, less than or equal to 6 furlongs, whereas actually the national average demonstrated a moderate increase in the number of starts less than or equal to 6 furlongs. So those are just simply 4 things where those individual tracks that saw the greatest, most significant drops in risk of fatality clearly stood out in some of the risk factors we've identified. So to conclude, I do honestly believe that there's the collective efforts of everyone in this industry over this side of the world, over this side of the pond, are starting to bear fruits. There's a significant improvement in a lot of the unknown variables as well that we're likely that we have yet to really get a handle on. It is critical that we continue to contribute to complete data recording. The more data we have, the better. I think the latest figures are that actually 96% of starts in 2015 contributed to the EID, which is a remarkable statistic. It's almost a complete census. And we would encourage those individual tracks, veterinarians, track regulators, to actually look at your own data, because I think you can make significant changes. Given it's such a vast country, there are bound to be very significant differences between the racing and the different racetracks that you look after. And I think there are going to be local differences that you can potentially have an impact on. As I said, I think there is a greater awareness of the importance of thoroughbred welfare, and I'm sure that it's more close to the front of people's minds to ensure that we make continual marginal gains. I think it's really critical. I think Sky Cycling in the UK were one of the first to talk about this. You know, they want to make a 1%, 0.5% difference. And if you do that across 10 things, you've made a 10 or a 5% difference in performance. And it's those little things. That's how we're going to be dealing with this in the next few years, 10 years. It's going to be making marginal gains that are going to contribute to a reduction in risk. Sharing of vet lists is an obvious thing that we would love to see going across racing jurisdictions. Harmonisation of medical regulations and veterinary list protocols. Again, efforts to move in those directions are clearly going to be welcome. And then finally, for us, being able to include medical records in models would be a real boon. And I don't think that's going to be something we'll be able to take to national models, but I think it's the sort of thing we might be able to do with individual tracks or groups of tracks where we get the agreement from individual trainers or veterinarians to include those medical records in models to actually identify whether they significantly improve the predictive ability of the models we produce. I'd just like to acknowledge the Jockey Club, Matt, Kristen and Jamie for all the help. We have regular teleconference to keep us on track, and they really keep us guided. And then Stamatis is the applied statistician who really builds the models and sits there and lets them run over the weekend. So, Kathy, if there are any questions, I'm happy to take them.
Thanks. The first question, is it possible racetracks have manipulated the way they report data that have contributed to the decrease?
I think that's extremely unlikely. I'm probably not best placed to talk to that. I think there's a good degree of quality assurance that goes on before the data are released to me, and I certainly have every confidence that the data that I receive is a true reflection of what's going on the track. So I think it's extremely unlikely.
Okay. Is data being collected on injuries that occur on workout days, not only the actual race day?
Again, probably better to talk to the people who collect the data, but I believe that is the case. I think the issue we have about including those data or actually modeling those data is there's probably a degree of inconsistency as to how that is reported between different tracks. So the whole point about starting with fatal injury on a race course is it's much easier clearly to identify, and we can be, one of the critical things about our modeling is that we have a very good tight case definition to be able to model as our outcome.
All right. Do we know how the rate of subfatal or the non-fatal injuries is going, be it bows or bone chips, tendons, et cetera?
Do we know how?
They want to know basically the non-fatal injuries.
The non-fatal injury. I haven't looked at that at all, actually. I wouldn't be able to comment
Okay.
what the rate of non-fatal injury is going.
All right. Do we have data that shows how many racing fatalities since 2009 have occurred on turns versus straightaways?
I don't have those data. We have data within the EID that actually talks about where the injury occurred at various different pole markers. I think there is a risk in putting too much on that, in that certainly, how many years ago now? 15 years ago, we did some video analyses of racing injuries in the UK, and actually identifying exactly where the final injury occurred is not that easy. You can identify where the horse comes to ground, which is where it may be reported as having occurred, but actually there's probably a number of strides prior to that, and it's not just often just a one-off event that actually occurs. So actually, the reliability of where the injury is reported is probably a more difficult thing, but certainly you could break it down in turns and turf, and I'm going to be speaking to Mick about whether we can combine our analyses to try and add turn radius data into the models we've got and see if that makes a difference.
And another, at what point does the interval between races become a risk factor?
The what between races? Interval?
The interval of time.
For individual horses or on the same track? Good question.
Let
Who
you
knows?
go with either way.
Well, I think so. We've shown there that so if you take it for the same horses, their interval between races is important. The longer that is, then that's a good thing. Probably not stretching it out too far. You have to. What we have is the time between starts, and that could be related to lots of different things. It could be a trainer decision to actually give the horse a rest. It could equally be because the horse has some minor niggling injury that means it can't come back. I think we did show, I think it's probably, if you look at time between races or race meets actually related to the race course, probably less of an importance over here given that most of the turf racing is on relatively firm going. We did do some work in the UK where we showed that actually if you waited at least, I think it was 7 to 9 days since the previous race meet, then actually the risk started to reduce. But that was mostly related to going that was good to soft going and that sort of thing. So it's related to the ability of the ground to recover. So I don't think that's really going to be a concern over here.
Okay. Another is any future efforts for data analysis to focus on non-fatals? And then it says more data points should yield stronger results. So they're just looking for, the efforts of data analysis to focus on non-fatal.
Yeah, so we do have vision to start looking at fetlock-related fracture as an outcome, specifically because we then might be able to start including previous EID recorded injuries or examinations at that site as a potential risk factor. So that's certainly something we'd want to be looking at, yeah.
All right, I actually don't have any more questions, but I do have Kristen Leschny who's going to talk a little bit about the quality control measures.
Thank you, Kathy. To speak to the question about whether tracks have manipulated the data, I agree with Tim. I think the answer to that question is no. We actually have a 3-part quality control system that we do before we even send the data to Dr. Parkin to ensure that reporting is complete and accurate. The tracks actually have to mark everyday quality controlled within the equine injury database. We compare racing charts to look for incidents that appear to have resulted in an injury or a fatality. And then we work with Dr. Mary Scalay, and she actually reviews all of the data to ensure that injuries that are reported appear to be correctly reported and accurately reported as a fatality. So we really do try to make sure that that data is complete and accurate before Dr. Parkin even sees it. We do collect injuries for training. Those, as Dr. Parkin said, are not as consistently reported, mostly because of manpower available at the racetrack during training times. And we also collect non-fatal injury data. To date, we've got about 80,000 reports in the equine injury database. The majority of those are scratches, so we collect scratches, pre-race scratches as well. And just one reminder for people both in the room and also watching live, if you have questions, please send them while the speaker is still up, and also please use Twitter with the hashtag #HorseSummit.
Thank you, Dr. Parkin. And also as a reminder, if you're going to use Twitter, send it to @JockeyClub. That's the handle. So we're going to take a short break now, just about 10 minutes. We're going to have a slight deviation from the program in that we're going to come back at 10:35, and we're going to hear from Jim Gagliano, who's president of the Jockey Club, along with Rusty Ford, who's with the Kentucky Department of Agriculture. And they're going to give us an update on the Mercer County situation, where there's been reported neglect of some horses. So again, in your program, it says come back at 10:40. Please come back at 10:35. Enjoy your break.